Okay, welcome back. We're moving on to chapter number 2, which is Notarial Acts and Procedures. So, welcome back to the online version of the functions and duties of a California Notary Public. And let's move on and start talking about some of the important notary tools that you're going to need to perform your notary duties. So, aside from the notary seal, the most important tool that you're going to need is, of course, your notary journal. Now, you'll remember our discussion of notary employees and how a notary employee working for a private employer is permitted to notarize outside of office hours. Now, keep in mind that a notary is only permitted to use one journal at a time, and all of the entries must be sequential, and that is according to date and time. In other words, as an employee, you might be tempted to use one section of the journal for your employer and maybe a separate section, let's say in the back, for your own private notary work. But that practice is not permitted. In addition to that, once a new journal has been started for any reason whatsoever, no other entries may be made in that old journal. That journal, as well as all of your notary journals, must be kept in a locked and secured location, and they have to be under your exclusive control. No one, including your employer, is permitted to have access to those journals unless you're present there with them. If anyone in your office or home has access to a locked room or a filing cabinet, for example, where the journals can be viewed by someone outside of your presence, then the rule of thumb is that your journal is not under direct and exclusive control, and you may be subject to a suspension or revocation of your commission, as well as any civil or criminal penalties. Keep your journal safe and under your control and only your control. Now we're going to talk about how to fill out journals a little bit later on in the course, but for now, you need just to be aware that every notarial act that you're going to perform is required to be recorded in that notary journal. Additionally, that notary act is to be recorded at the time the notary act is performed, not earlier and not later. If you willfully fail to record the information in your journal or willfully fail to properly maintain your journal in any other manner, you will be guilty of a misdemeanor. Recording proper journal entries is a critical component to accurate and complete notarial work. Now, copies of your journal records might be requested, and they may be requested by anyone for any reason, but there's a way that request has to be made. It must be made in writing and not over the phone. Now, be sure to let the requester know that they need to include in their request the name of the party or parties, the type of document that was notarized, the month and the year of the notary transaction. By the way, you may not charge more than 30 cents per page for these copies, and that even includes your time to research those copies. Now, as you can imagine, it's very possible, even likely since multiple records are entered on a single journal page, some records will appear that are not associated with the transaction in question. In other words, someone is asking you for a copy of a line item of a journal. Now, that line item is going to be included on that page along with other notarial acts that you performed. When you copy the requested journal entry, you'll need to cover all of the unrelated entries so they won't be included in that copy. You'll only have 15 calendar days to respond to this request, or you'll need to provide notification to the requester that that item does not exist in your journal. Okay, you might want to jot down these notes. The request from a member of the public for a journal record must be made in writing. It must include the names of the parties. It must name the type of the document, and don't forget to include the month and year of notarization. Of course, you'll remember that we specifically pointed out that a notary is to retain exclusive control over the journal, and it must be kept locked and secured. Consequently, if the employer wants copies of any or all of the journal records related to that employer's business transactions, the notary that's an employee is not permitted just to hand over the journal so that the employer can copy unless that notary remains present during the process. You know, the notary even needs to remain present if the journal is to be handed over to the employer just for review. Now, if the notary also happens to notarize outside of the place of employment, that notary is going to have entries that are not associated with the business. And remember that they're sequential. So if you hand a journal over to an employer, for example, well, there are going to be entries there on those pages that are not associated with that employer. The same thing happens if you need to make photocopies of journal entries that are associated with that employer's business. So if the employer wants copies of the journal entries, the notary must be present, and either the notary must make the copies or at least the notary must supervise the copies that are going to be made in order to ensure that no copies of entries that are unrelated to that employer are going to be included. Okay, I'm going to introduce to you a term that you really don't need to know, but at least you should recognize it if it shows up on the exam. And it's called a subpoena ducis tecum. And I hope I've said that correctly. But a subpoena ducis tecum is a court summons ordering the recipient to produce tangible evidence for use at a hearing or trial. So if such a legal request is made, and the requested evidence is the notary journal, the notary must provide a journal for examination, and the notary must remain present while they're being examined or copied, and the notary must certify those copies if requested. What I want you to notice is that the notary must remain present even during this type of procedure. Okay, so the journal may not be surrendered to an employer, even upon termination or resignation of the job. In fact, the notary may not surrender the journal to anyone except the Secretary of State, as we previously discussed, or the county clerk. Once your commission is expired or terminated, remember you have 30 days to turn your journals into the county clerk's office. And a peace officer, but that is under certain conditions, and we'll talk about that right now. If a peace officer requests a copy of the journal in the course of an investigation or other official business, you are required to surrender that journal, but you're going to need to obtain a receipt for the journal because you'll need to notify the California Secretary of State that you surrendered that journal to the peace officer. So if this happens, you'll need to notify the California Secretary of State by certified mail within 10 business days. Now, just a quick note about the days to respond and possible test questions. We've seen references to 30 days, references to 15 days, and now we've got 10 business days that are allowed for a response, and all of these various situations, and it can really get challenging to keep them all in order. So, a notary is permitted or allowed 30 days for almost everything. That's sort of a default time period. But now remember that we've had a couple of exceptions. One of those exceptions has been 15 days to respond to any member of the public for copies of the journal records. Remember, if a member of the public requests a copy of a journal record, the notary has 15 days to respond. And now we have 10 days to notify the Secretary of State if a journal is surrendered to a peace officer. Okay, so we have 30 days so far, 15 days, and 10 days. And so you should be able to remember those exceptions if they come up on the exam. Now, when you do notify the Secretary of State that you had to surrender your journal to a peace officer, well, you're going to include in that notification the receipt that you receive for the journal, and then you'll also need to include the following information in that notification. You'll need to include the dates that are covered for the journal entries that were surrendered. So that journal is going to have a period of dates from the beginning to the end. You'll want to include the dates of those journal entries in your notification. You'll need to include your Notary Public commission number. That's how you're identified by the Secretary of State, is with your commission number. So be sure to include that. A copy of the expiration date of your commission, and a copy of the receipt that the peace officer gave for the journal. Now, if the notary journal is stolen, or it's lost, misplaced, destroyed, damaged, or otherwise it's rendered unusable, the Notary Public must immediately notify the Secretary of State, once again by certified or registered mail. Now, this notification must include, again, the dates covered for the journal entries. That makes sense. The Notary Public's commission number, again, that's how you're identified. The expiration date of the commission, and, when it's applicable, a photocopy of any police report that specifies the theft of that journal. So if your journal was stolen, presumably you'll have a police report. If it's lost, of course you won't. So now we've added yet another response time to our list. We had 30 days for almost everything. We have 15 days to respond to a public request for a journal entry or journal copy. 10 days to notify the Secretary of State if a peace officer requests surrender of a journal. And now we have immediate notification to the Secretary of State regarding a lost, stolen, or damaged notary journal. Of course, you'll remember from our previous section, we also stated that a notary must immediately notify the Secretary of State if he or she resigns the notary commission early by moving out of the state or their commission is terminated for any other reason. So, okay, back to the notary journal. Since only one active journal is permitted to be used at any time, if for any reason you need to begin another journal, remember you may never again use that old journal for new entries. So, for example, let's say the journal's lost and then in a few days later you find it. Well, if you've already started a new journal, you may not go back to using that previous journal. You don't need to make lines on the blank pages or anything else. Just hold on to it. Your new journal starts the new date sequence. Okay, I think I've already mentioned this, but let me just mention it one more time just in case, because there's been a lot of information we've talked about. And this is always a question during a live seminar. What do we do with the old notary journals? Or do I need to turn my journals in every time I recommission? And so let me just kind of clear all of that up. What happens to the notary journals if you decide at the end of your term you don't want to reapply? Well, if your notary commission expires or if it's terminated for any reason, including a significant lapse in commissions, and by significant what we mean is more than 30 days, you must turn in all of the notary journals that you have collected over the years to the county clerk's office where your most recent oath and bond are on file. Now, as I said, you'll have 30 days to do that. And if you willfully fail to turn over your journals, you can be charged with a misdemeanor and, of course, as always, be held personally liable for damages caused by not turning over your journals. If it turns out that you are recommissioning right now and there's more than 30 days that have lapsed between your commissions or will lapse between your commissions, you should take those journals, even though you're recommissioning, you should take those journals to the county clerk's office and start all over again, because you're not permitted to allow more than a 30-day lapse without submitting those journals to that county clerk's. Now, it's important to keep this really clear. Your journals go to the county clerk's office, not the Secretary of State. Only turn the journals over to the county clerk when your commission expires and you're not seeking recommission right away. And of course, otherwise, keep all of your journal records together, commission term after commission term, and you keep them in a locked and secured area and always under your exclusive control.